Good evening, everybody. And it's been a very long day for the first major full day of our 57th conference of the International Making Cities Livable conference series, begun in 1985 by Suzanne Leonard and Henry Lennard. Henry was a medical sociologist, and Suzanne was an architectural scholar. Henry was from Vienna, Suzanne was from the UK, and they wanted to bring the lessons of Europe and the lessons of the world, really, around the world to exchange with the United States and have some of the lessons from the United States exchanged with Europe as well. And as many of you know, some of you know, most of you who've been part of the conference already, we've decided to continue the legacy of Suzanne and Henry at Suzanne's request when she was very ill late in her life, because there has been such a great momentum to this conference and such an important, I think, legacy, learning from one another, from peer-to-peer exchanges about how to make cities that are more livable, healthier, higher quality of life, more enjoyable, more vibrant, more successful, more equitable, and greener, certainly. All of those things that we all care about. And as I said earlier today, you know, we all know what livable cities are. They're the places that we go and pay a lot of money oftentimes because we want to be in those places, right? We want to be in walkable, vibrant, mixed, dynamic, diverse places with all kinds of interesting things going on. And that's what we all want in our own homes and our own neighborhoods. And by the way, that also has great benefits in terms of the health benefits, the social benefits, creativity, economic development, greenness, sustainability, resilience, and all those other factors that we all recognize are so very important in our time. And so what the IMCL is all about is not just, okay, we want it, but how do we do it? How do we overcome the barriers and learn the tools and the strategies that we can share with one another? And I know many of you who've been part of the conference know that already, but we have some new folks as well, and some folks that are joining us by video who maybe are interested in the IMCL and want to know a little bit more about it. So what we're going to do tonight is to do a little bit deeper dive into some of the issues we talked about earlier today. We're going to start actually at a more general level of what are the issues for livable cities and why are they important? Why should people care about them? Why are they, what is the reason that I, as a mayor, a planner, or a citizen, or whatever role I play, why should I care about these things? And then I think we want to dive deeper into some of these issues. And Ellen Dunham-Jones, who you saw earlier, and June Williamson, the two colleagues who have just published the book called Case Studies in Retrofitting Suburbia, are going to give us a bit of a deeper dive. And then we will once again have a panel. The mayor will introduce that panel. And we'll have an opportunity to discuss that further. So those of you who are have the Attendify app, I hope many of you do, you can ask a moderator questions of the audience or of the panel and put those into your Attendify app like you did earlier today. And we'll have a good discussion. I don't want to go too long. I know it's been a long day, and many of you are tired, as we all are. And we have another big day tomorrow and another big day on Friday, so we won't take too long. But what we want to do first is have a greeting from some of our friends internationally who unfortunately have not been able to join us, and also some of our friends who have been involved with Suzanne and the IMCL for many, many years. And we'll have a couple of videos, and then we'll have some folks come up on the stage personally. If you have something you'd like to say about Suzanne or Henry or both of them, please make yourself known down there, and we'll come around and bring you out to talk about them. We want to make this a wonderful tribute to them and to the legacy that they have left us all to take this all forward. What we're going to do first is the mayor is going to make some additional comments about his point of view of the IMCL and his relationship to Suzanne, why this has been important to him and to Carmel, and certainly why Carmel, I will say why Carmel has been important to the IMCL, and I'll say, first of all, by this fantastic host venue that we have and this wonderful experience that we're all enjoying today. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Mayor Jim Brainard and ask him to say a few comments about Suzanne and Henry and the IMCL. Mayor Brainard.
As we look back at the history of cities, we realize that there's thousands of years of knowledge about how to build cities that are livable, places that people want to be, places where people from different backgrounds come together, places where people can discuss ideas that can advance civilization. These things generally happen in cities where people from all different walks of life come together. And as I said, some of you may have been here this morning when I talked about the first time I spoke with Dr. Suzanne Leonard. I received a phone call in City Hall, my office, about 12 years ago, and she had read about what Carmel was doing on something in the internet, I believe, and she wanted to talk, and we talked for over an hour about cities, and I learned about the IMCL. She invited me to come and speak in Portland, and it's been such a valuable, good experience from which I've been able to learn a lot in my role as mayor. Over the years, met so many tremendous people that are thinking about the same issues that I thought about every day. It's been a great resource for me and for our staff at Carmel. And I started to attend the IMCL meetings that were held both in this country and in Europe. And from each one, I learned something. But I learned so much from Suzanne, and even though I never met Henry, I learned from his books how he approached viewing cities and learning how people interacted in various public spaces. And so many of the things that the IMCL was promoting, I had heard in various ways from members of the public when I campaigned. I'd go to people's doors, and you'd start to see a pattern after a period of time in their questions and their hopes and their aspirations for the place they had chosen to spend their lives. And it was this yearning for a traditional city where they had lots of social contact, where they could walk places they needed to go, where they were proud of their civic buildings. And so much of this had been destroyed when, I look back and, we still had walkable cities at the end of World War II. The car really hadn't made its way into society that much, but after the war, it did very quickly. And we just literally, I think, threw out so many rules that, not rules as much as thousands of years of experience about how to design livable places. But the IMCL saw this, the members saw this very clearly, and it wasn't just architecture for great architecture's sake. It was architecture about places, about how the architecture would work with how people interacted in a space. And that was I think the unique partnership that Suzanne and Henry had. He looked at it as a sociologist, how people interact in these spaces. Suzanne looked at it as a trained architect and how these things work together. And so many times, I think, architecture, especially in the last decades, has been a focus on monumental buildings with very little thought about how a pedestrian views these buildings. It's many times just about a monumental piece of architecture, not about a place that people can thrive in. So it's been a great learning experience for me to learn from some of the best people thinking about these issues, studying these issues, looking at data, how good city design impacts public health, how it impacts social interaction, how it impacts mental health, and how I think it's also important as we look at the fabric of representative government and democracy that we focus on how city design interacts with our governmental system too. You know, you go all the way back to the Roman Forum, you know, which is a place for people from all different backgrounds to come together. And it begs the question, are we building places like that today? Some cities are and others aren't. And I think it's important, and the IMCL is focused on these issues. So I have learned a tremendous amount from the IMCL and the founders. And so it's, I think, are we ready, Michael, to show the videos of a tribute to Suzanne? Michael's going to introduce this, okay? Yeah. Here's Michael.
So, as many of you know, we have had many international colleagues who haven't been able to join us this year, unfortunately, because of the residual travel restrictions and the policies that we hope will be changing in the next month or so. We were probably 1 month too early, you know, to actually have this event, to have our international colleagues join us. But we've asked them to join us by video and to give us their thoughts on Suzanne and Henry and the IMCL, and to share their greetings, share their stories, really. And one of them, a very special greeting, is the mayor of Porto, Portugal. And I told you that next year we're going to be doing the next IMCL conference in Paris, France, and you're all warmly invited to come there. However, as you will see, the mayor of Porto, Portugal is very keen for us to all gather in his beautiful city. So let's have a look.
Hello everybody. I would like to greet all the participants in the 57th International Making Cities Livable Conference 2021, and a special remark to Mayor James Brainard, your host in Carmel, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Portland in 2019. I hope you will enjoy Carmel as I would have enjoyed if I could have been present physically. And of course, a special word to Michael Mehaffy. He's been doing a great job on IMCL. Unfortunately, I can't be with you for reasons that we all understand. And I hope that we can find each other all together next year. And remember, Porto would like to host one of your meetings. So maybe we should consider this application if you would consider that. The COVID-19 made us look differently at public space. In a way, it has given us the chance to reclaim what had been taken by cars and by private occupation. In our city, what we see today is people want more and more to be able to dwell in the public space, be it in parks, be it in streets, be it in gardens, be it in the beach. So in a way, there is a lesson to be learned with COVID-19, with all the difficulties we have been looking through. I know you will also debate important things like affordable housing, something that is affecting all the Western world, and also climate resilience and adaptation. We really need to talk about these issues and take effective measures to tackle the problems. But the latest developments in the United States give us a lot of hope. I could not finish this message without a word about Suzanne Leonard. I first met her in 2018 here in Porto. And she came with Michael and told me what they think about Porto and what they wanted me to tell the others about what we were doing here. The days we spent here in Porto are unforgettable. I met her then in Portland, and she was unfortunately already very sick. And for me, it was a disastrous day when I heard about the sad news, which unfortunately we all expected. But she is a source of inspiration. She invited me to visit her in Portland and participate in the 57th International Making Cities Livable meeting. And of course, I could not refuse. And from then, I've learned about the work she did with her late husband and its importance. She will always be an inspiration to me, and I hope to all of you. So it is with great pleasure to address you, unfortunately by video, but I hope to be able to do it in the future with you live when things settle down, and again to invite you to the city of Porto. Good work and good luck, because we all need luck in these trying times.
This is video that we shot in Porto, Suzanne and I. Suzanne was right next to me when I filmed this. Very beautiful city, as you can see, and many, many lessons. They're doing amazing things there, as they are here in Carmel as well. So now I have one more video, which is a compilation of several of our wonderful colleagues in Europe who also have not been able to join us. I'll turn it over to the projectionist to show us that one as well.
I got involved actually more than a quarter of a century ago. It was in the year 1992 when there was a conference in Charleston, and we were invited as the city of Freiburg to get an award. And I came over to Charleston, and well, I must say, to put it this way, I fall in love with this type of conference, and I was very much impressed by the intentions and the aims and goals of making cities livable. And ever since we had very close contact, 3 years later, we had a big conference in Freiburg, 1995. And in the first years, of course, it was a very close relationship to both, to Henry and Suzanne Leonard. And of course, after Henry died in Venice, then all the activities of making cities were in the hand of Suzanne, and we had a very close friendship over all the years. I was very much impressed that they put out the ideas of the human scale of town planning. I always had in mind the fighting of Suzanne against high-rising buildings in residential areas, but she was, above all, I think, an expert in sociology, the impact of the public space on social experiences, on the social context between the persons. That was, well, her top favorite goal. And I never had known a person who knew better all the squares in Europe and all over the world than Suzanne. And that was beautiful. And I learned quite a lot of that.
Suzanne was a wonderful person. I mean, and I was so glad to actually meeting her. You know, Suzanne, it's like she's been always in my life in a way, in my kind of academic life that I was dealing with cities, because she was such an important person. Because she came also a few times to Barcelona. I mean, she came to teach a little bit at the Institute. At that time, it was still Creal, not IS Global. So that was very nice. You know, we shared the same passion for making cities more livable and also healthy, and also the health aspects she really liked. And then before she came, she was particularly interested in the plazas, the squares in Gracia, that she made a special study of that. I mean, because we have this unique situation in Barcelona with the plazas where you get a lot of people coming together and doing things. So she really loved that. So she came to study that for a bit. I remember the last time I saw her here in Barcelona was when we were walking on the Ramblas, the Poblenou. I don't know if you know the Ramblas, the Poblenou. It's one of these beautiful streets where people walk. There are lots of trees. There are sidewalks for cycling. There are no cars, so it's one of these lovely areas. So we're walking up and down, and we had lovely dinner. 58, but it was a restaurant, and and it was always so good to see her here or at the conferences, talking to her. I mean, particularly because she was so interested in health, and she tried to get me also to come to the conference to talk about health, because that's my speciality. I come from a public health background, and I'm very sorry not to be able to come to the meeting, and I hope it will be a great meeting, and certainly I hope to be there next year. And Suzanne was very keen to bring it to Barcelona some stage, so
well, let's talk about
hopefully that well, to see you here in Barcelona over the next few years. That
I first met Suzanne Crowhurst Lennard 16 years ago at the IMCL meeting in the other Carmel. This one was in Monterey, California. Her husband, UC San Francisco psychiatrist, was very ill at the time, and I was impressed at how she cared for and attended to him. I also recognized Suzanne's superb poise and demeanor, a classiness and beauty that so infused her appreciation of architecture, of city spaces, of physical and mental health, but also of history, poetry, and art. Over the years, I attended many of the IMCL conferences. I'm sorry I'm not there with you now, but I've got a wedding in the family that very day. But at the conferences, I learned much and met so many superb people. And that was one of Suzanne's great strengths, was bringing people together. And like every coin has two sides, heads and tails, the other side is called the obverse. And Suzanne Leonard was my obverse. And even though I had a strong immersion in the classics, my career has been a medical one. I became a pediatrician, an epidemiologist, a specialist in environmental health. And much of my early work focused on environmental hazards to children, especially pesticides. But when I became director of CDC's National Center for Environmental Health, we were very focused on atoms of toxic substances, of toxic molecules, things that stay in the environment for long periods of time and may have hormonal and other very serious effects. We did measurements of chemicals in people's body burdens, we did much work around air pollution and asthma. And over and over again, I came back to the realization that so many of the illnesses we were looking at were related to how we burn fossil fuels and how we are misusing our environment, how we build our buildings, how we create our cities. And by the way, how we are destroying life on Earth through deforestation and the burning of fossil fuels. And so about 20 years ago, I worked with my friend Howard Frumkin and Andy Dannenberg and others. We began to pull together the arguments as to why the built environment was influencing and how it was influencing human health so very much. I was eventually on the board of the American Institute of Architects, got to know many of the people who were your speakers. And but along the way, as I got to know Suzanne, I realized that here was a PhD architect who embodied Vitruvius' assertions from 2 millennia ago of the attributes of a good building: firmitas, utilitas, and venistas. Firmitas, strength and resilience. Utilitas, it's got to be useful, it's got to be practical. And venustas, beauty and comfort to the spirit. And a small example of venustas I want to just reflect about Suzanne Leonard was when she was so ill, and we remember that time. We all felt so helpless, as did she. And one late winter day, a few years ago, I sent her a big bunch of bright yellow daffodils. And the next day, Suzanne called me to say in her stylish diction, "Dick, thank you very much. How did you know I love daffodils?" And then she poignantly, at that spot, recited from memory a much-loved William Wordsworth poem that begins, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils beside a lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze." And the poem ends with the line suitable for all of those coming out of a pandemic, as he thinks back, "For oft, when on my couch I lie in vacant and pensive mood, they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And I think that captured a spontaneous recitation by Suzanne was very much who she was. And I want to reflect and dedicate much of the work that we all do to Suzanne.
I'd hoped to be able to say it to her myself, but I just wanted her to know I have learned more from you, Suzanne, than from anybody else, and more from this conference than from any other conference that I've ever gone to. I've been a city councilor now for 20 years, and I think your principles work, and I'm so glad I went to that very first one 20 years ago in Santa Fe. So thank you for all the knowledge and wisdom that you've shared with me.
I've known Suzanne since the 60s.
Right.
She was a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ahead of me at architectural school in Bristol. And where she was doing a B.Arch, I think she got her B.Arch in 68 and I got mine in 70, something like that. So, and Suzanne and I think read the same books at the in the university library, and The Death and Life of the Great American City was certainly one of them, and I think we've always seen eye to eye ever since. You know, partly through the spectacles of Jane Jacobs.
Yeah,
and, so Suzanne has been really important in my life, and probably second to Jane Jacobs, the woman who's been really more influential to me in terms of playful, healthy cities and sensibly designed cities that are not monocultures and children, you know, child-friendly cities in particular. We've been absolutely eye to eye. I went on after architectural school, possibly influenced partly by Suzanne, to look at play in the city and adventure play, and became chair of Bristol Adventure Play Association. And so our lives we've had very parallel lives for architects, really, in a way that we've strayed away. I mean, I've designed lots of buildings, but I've never put buildings first. I've always put place and people and community and neighborhood and connectivity and scale in front of architecture as object building.
Right. Our friend Peter Ellman liked to say we're shifting our focus from objects to places. And I think that's true, although I wish more designers were doing that. And you know, we still have the object building sensibility that sometimes don't.
Well, I'm afraid, I think it is more of a male construct in that I think if we had more women in planning in the earlier days, I don't believe we would have ended up with the nonsense that we've ended up with. And I see still a sort of macho attitude to the building of towers and senseless high densities. I mean, I'm for for good high density that creates walkable cities. But I think Suzanne was absolutely right in putting the livability of the city absolutely first, and that and I have noticed that there is an element of gender about that thinking, and maybe it is. And I like to think that I've probably been more influenced by that. Jane and Suzanne. And Jane, I was fortunate enough while I was president of the RIBA to call her. She'd always been one of my great heroes, and to call her to give her an honorary fellowship of the RIBA when I was able to do that.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, it's
so let's put those two in the same box. They've been incredibly influential.
Yeah.
And the determination of Suzanne to produce 50 conferences, I think she was relentless. She was amazing, an extraordinary and impossible act to follow.
Yeah, well, we're going to try to do her justice, as you know, and to continue the series. It's actually been 56 so far, and this will be 57, right? And so we're going to do our best to continue and to bring people like yourself and the other stewards who have been friends of hers and Henry's over the years to continue their legacy. So we have a lot to live up to, don't we? So I wanted to bring on one person who's a good friend of Suzanne's, and I think will tell you how she's been influenced by Suzanne, Kay Sullivan, who's developing a wonderful new community in Florida. Kay?
Thank you, Michael. I have to tell you that it's a great pleasure to be able to speak at Suzanne's tribute, because I also had the opportunity to speak at Henry's memorial at the Columbia Low Library after Henry passed away in 2005 at Suzanne's request. When Suzanne and Henry invited my family to join them in Italy in the summer of 2003, it turned out to be the experience of a lifetime. To have two experts, yet very humble and real people who knew the languages in the countries we visited, to take us around, give us the backdoor entrance to be able to view the cities, the remarkable livable cities, through their eyes, was such a treasure. But they made us work too. At that time, my daughters that came along with my husband and myself, one of my daughters was 13, one was 19, or about those ages. And I don't know how much they really appreciated the work then, but Suzanne would give us assignments, tell us, obviously they were keen observers of city life and of people. And they would ask us to tell them what was going on in the square, how would the square change over the day, etc., which was a really big learning experience for all of us. And then Henry, also quite the keen observer and people watcher. I remember one time when he moved us in a restaurant 3 times in order to find just the perfect location to create a memorable conversation and evening. And Henry used to say often, we exist because of the stories we tell. So he wanted to hear stories, he wanted to create stories. But some of what I remember most, wherever we were, whether it was in Venice, meeting with Eddie, the former mayor of Venice, or Sven, who you saw on the screen a few minutes ago, who was mayor of Freiburg and later the regional governor, or whether it was Paris, where we met with Henry's daughter, Lizzie. Henry would look me firmly in the eye, point to me, and say, tell the story. And this is the story. Several months before we were invited to go join the Lennards in Italy, I had contacted Henry and Suzanne. I thought it was high time they knew that their book, Livable Cities Observed, had changed our lives. Here was a social worker and a tax attorney, unlikely people to just set out on such a course, but we explained it was all because of them. We had read the book, and here we were, moving forward. We said, we're already 3 years into it, and by the way, I thought you needed to know. So after sending my email, which in those days felt like you were sending it out into cyberspace, not knowing if you'd ever hear anything further, the response was swift and clear. Come to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and give a talk on a Children First community. And Suzanne said, then in May, we will come to Florida. We will see your community and what your plans are. on our way to Italy for our European conference. And of course, both of those things happened. And after they left, Suzanne and Henry went on to the European conference, and Suzanne began to write me. She said, "I know you love the imagery in the books, but but it will all come alive for you. So come to Italy and let us show you what livable cities look like." So of course we did that. How could we pass that up, right? So, and you can see how fast the timeline went. So here we are now, many, many years later, and we're a lot further in the development of our little town known as Winthrop, a community which when they visited, although really virtually nothing was there, but they could see it. And they said they were so happy that we were building a town based on values and principles that we shared. So here we have many people that have spoken tonight whose influence was led by Suzanne and Henry. And there are many points of light around the world thanks to the epic works of Suzanne and Henry. And as I close, I want to say that the way in which I learned about them originally was my husband and I attended a tribute for an older man in our community in Florida who had passed away unexpectedly. He was a community leader, but he'd also been an advisor on the Planning Commission. So we attended that tribute out of respect for our friend, and one of the speakers that afternoon was the director of planning from our community. And the man made an announcement that there would be 5 books donated in Henry's and Suzanne's, for my friend's memory, that would be in the library. And this man was being named for the complex of our combined cultural arts and library. So at the conclusion of that tribute, I walked across the lobby, announced to the librarian for my own tribute to our dear friend that I will be the first person to check out those books. And as you might well have imagined already, one of those books was Livable Cities Observed. And so at that point, we changed directions, stopped what we were doing, and became town founders. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. I can't tell you how much Suzanne and Henry have meant to me and my family. In fact, not only is my husband here, of course, but my daughter Sarah, who was the 13-year-old at the time and was so influenced by Henry that she went into sociology likewise. And as some of you know, Henry's uncle taught him that real innovation takes place where multiple disciplines intersect. I think that's one of the things he really liked and why he so much wanted me to tell this story, because we were unusual, but so were Suzanne and Henry, if you think about it. Henry was a sociologist. Suzanne told me when she was starting out, she actually wanted to be a theatrical set designer. But her father said, "Why don't you become an architect and build sets for life?" So Suzanne took her father's advice and she became an architect, but she found that really the architecture schools weren't teaching what she wanted to know. Then, of course, she met Henry, and they were a match in heaven, and then thus became these conferences. And these conferences, the IMCL conferences, are built on the foundation of multiple disciplines. This is why you come here and you might meet a social worker who would give a presentation. It's all the vast number of professions that can come together to create new ideas. So I'm pleased to be here. And the last time I saw Suzanne, and we used to like to call each other birthday twins or birthday sisters because we share the same birthday, July 11th. But the last time I saw her in Portland, Oregon in 2019, she said, please, I believe it was 2019, she said, please promise me that you will come to speak in Carmel. So this is why, having spoken the first time in 2003, I'm back to speak again and feel so honored to have the opportunity to speak at her tribute. It's been a great journey, and I have learned so much. Thank you so much. And thank you, Michael. I think that you have stepped into some big shoes and you're filling them up very nicely, and Suzanne would be enormously pleased with how you are carrying the conference series forward.
Thank you, Kay. That's a wonderful story and a wonderful tribute. And you know, when we die, if we're lucky, we pass on something, we pass on a legacy, and I guess that's immortality. And I think Suzanne and Henry have that. So they're wonderful people, and we have, as you said, we have big shoes to fill, and we'll do our best. Okay, we're going to have one more session before the end of the evening, and that is another deep dive into some of the issues that we're all talking about, the content of this great conference and a great venue. And I'm pleased to invite Ellen Dunham-Jones and June Williamson to join us. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Let's see, all right. In this morning's plenary, Mayor Brainard, Chris Leinberger, and June and I made the case that retrofitting suburbia is fiscally responsible, it's what the market wants, despite a setback by the pandemic, and it helps existing suburban communities meet today's urgent challenges by redeveloping, re-inhabiting, or re-greening aging shopping malls, office parks, and other parking lot-dominated sites. Tonight, we're going to expand on that discussion with a particular focus on infrastructure for livability. Instead of describing specific case studies, we're going to generalize more about the big picture and tactics. My comments will be illustrated by a few case studies, but I'm not going to speak to them directly. You can kind of just read the slides and figure it out. Now, the suburbs have generally emphasized privacy and the value of private space, domestic or in a shopping mall. They've emphasized private space over the quality of public space and gathering. Back when most suburban households had kids, social life was assumed to center on the schools. Nightlife was forbidden. You don't want that near schools. Today, the majority of suburban households are either empty nesters or young adults whose jobs are in the burbs. And even before the pandemic, loneliness was determined to be at epidemic levels, especially in suburbia. Add to this the growing divide between rich and poor suburbs, the suburbanization of poverty, and there's both a great need and great success in building suburbia's social infrastructure with places to gather, to learn, to provide care, and grow social capital. In the best retrofits, social infrastructure, green infrastructure, and enhanced multimodal transportation infrastructure are integrated into high-performing, synergistic, and affordable systems. Today, we all know in the US that the Biden-Harris administration is pushing a massive infrastructure bill. The specifics of the proposal and its paths to implementation are morphing daily. But here we are in Indiana. So in case any of you have Mayor Pete's ear, of course now Secretary Pete, here's what I'd like to tell him. For the past 70 years, transportation planning has overemphasized the commute trip, and it's resulted in the reproduction of sprawl. Pre-pandemic, 46% of trips in the US were 3 miles or less. A pretty easy bike ride for most, not all, if we had more bike lanes and sidewalks in our existing places. But we don't. That's why we generate so many trips by car from the typical suburban house. And yet this is the essential last mile infrastructure that we need in order to make transit viable, to increase public health, and direct private investment into existing communities instead of ever outward chewing up more countryside with more highways. Pre-pandemic, the commute trip was only 20% of trips. 80%. All the rest of the trips, though, had really been ignored by transportation planners. A little bit of a gender bias there. During the pandemic, Zooming replaced commuting for many. Suddenly, the non-commute trips took center stage. From Paris to New York, mayoral hopefuls have recently campaigned on the promise of delivering the 15-minute city, the idea that one's everyday needs should be accessible within a quarter-hour walk or bike ride. The concept exploded during the pandemic as cars gathered dust and urban streets exploded with Zoom-fatigued pedestrians and cyclists. The same thing happened in many suburbs. Overnight, so-called bedroom suburbs became de facto live-work neighborhoods serviced by an endless parade of delivery vans. Garages, spare bedrooms, bonus rooms, and walk-in closets were converted into Wi-Fi classrooms, workspaces, and quarantine zones. Pre-World War II suburbs sidewalks and newer exurban subdivisions trails swelled at the end of the day with residents substituting their return commute with a daily walk or bike ride. Pop-up bike lanes appeared, and some streets were closed to non-resident vehicles and converted into communal play space for kids. As in cities, parking spaces in front of eateries were turned into streeteries, or parking lot patio dining. Larger parking lots hosted drive-in movies, concerts, and religious services, with cars serving as their occupants' PPE. Some lots were even converted to tent camps for those experiencing homelessness. Sanctioned or not, loved or hated, these temporary shifts in use are sparking communal conversations about livability, equity, and zoning. In the post-war, now that's the pre-World War II suburbs and the newer exurbs, but in the post-war suburbs, that had already been struggling pre-pandemic with a shortage of affordable housing, fear of gentrification, and a glut of vacant retail property, the pandemic has accelerated more permanent structural changes and retrofits. These include re-greening of underperforming asphalt with stormwater parks, reconstructed wetlands, and green infrastructure. Also with the re-inhabitation of commercial space as social infrastructure. Educational, healthcare, daycare, senior care, and medical uses are going into literally hundreds of dead big box stores. I've got them all in a database. And a growing number of rezonings of single-family home neighborhoods to encourage infill in the form of townhomes, cottage courts, small apartment buildings, even backyard granny flats, all the missing middle housing that increase affordability and density while maintaining the community's visual character. Even more transformational is the surge, especially in the last year. I mean, I've been documenting this stuff for 25 years. During the pandemic, we've seen a surge of proposals to redevelop dead shopping centers into compact, walkable, mixed-use town centers. Developers have been on a shopping spree. There also has been a surge, not quite as dramatic, in the infill of aging office parks with housing, shops, and multimodal connections, as well as more and more streets being put on road diets, shrinking the size and number of car lanes to add space for bike lanes, transit options, and sidewalks. Over 250 such suburban retrofits were already substantially completed before the pandemic. Hundreds more are in progress. Just the malls alone, it's hundreds. But throw in all the other categories and it really gets big numbers. As June and I document in our books, Retrofits of these sites are enabling suburban communities to disrupt automobile dependence, improve public health, support an aging population, compete for jobs, and add water and energy resilience. Instead of separating out transportation infrastructure from water infrastructure and social infrastructure and energy infrastructure, as we did when we originally built the suburbs, these retrofits are integrating multiple infrastructures to solve multiple problems simultaneously, more effectively and more cheaply. While the high cost of the Biden-Harris bill is being debated, and many decry the inclusion of social infrastructure as unnecessary and fiscally irresponsible, I say, look at Carmel. How is Carmel able to afford its investments in a great public realm? By increasing density, mixing uses, and integrating its infrastructural systems. It's looking inwards, it's building a city center instead of looking outwards and just expanding ever further out. It's reusing and repairing its infrastructure, like turning an abandoned railroad into the Monon Trail. So please, Indiana, let Secretary Pete know that you want to see transportation infrastructure investments that support and are integrated with social infrastructure. We should demand nothing less from all this new infrastructure. We want it to solve and address multiple challenges at the same time. And that's how we will enhance the livability of everyday needs, not just out-of-date assumptions that really the whole purpose of infrastructure is simply to provide commute trips. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to June to talk a little bit more detail about how.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to go super, super fast, and I just want to share with you some urban design tactics for suburban retrofitting. So just isolating some of these tactics for those of you who are designers, planners, developers. So first, garner input widely to build trust. This is so important to identify the key stakeholders and figure out ways to meet with them. And this can be more challenging in suburbs. And this is an inventory of the dozens of places of worship, schools, libraries, youth centers, parks, etc. in Wyandanch, New York, which was, if you were here this morning, one of the case studies in a very, very distressed suburb on Long Island. These are some of the images, the commuting parking lots into this very vibrant mixed place. And finally, then the public sector, the local legislature's office, having a district office in this location. Another tactic, reuse the box. So how can existing buildings and structures be remodeled and adapted? There was some discussion this morning about the parking structures. One can cut an atrium or a courtyard into the buildings and wrap them and all sorts of things. This is an example in Austin, Texas, at a shopping mall. One of the anchor department stores was converted into a community college math and computer lab in the big open large floor plate space. And here you can see the larger context, and a key piece of this is the addition of transit and a transit stop there, as the parking lots surrounding that mall are being infilled with housing and office and all sorts of other uses around the blue, which is the mall that's been converted for a community college campus. Another tactic, diversify uses. So what other delightful and desirable uses might be added to the urban design mix beyond what the conventional kind of ideas are? And this is La Gran Plaza de Fort Worth in Texas, where the interior of the mall is used for Mexican wrestling, and another anchor department store turned into a multi-stall mercado space. And then this is an oldie but goodie diagram. It never is not worth sharing again to remind us of the synergies of vertical mixed use and all the different things that could slot in. Here it's residential, restaurant, office, and retail, but what other kinds of uses can we begin to imagine that get us beyond the live, work, and play mix? So medical and wellness, education, entertainment, extending to board game cafes. I predict that's going to be one of the ways where people will want to gather again in person. Civic uses, all sorts of ways of thinking about the sharing economy in all kinds of ways. You may not want to Zoom from home. Even if you are working at home, you want to go to a co-working space, perhaps nearby, to do that remote working. And light industrial, too. If it's not polluting, these kinds of spaces can be integrated into retrofits. And then, of course, infrastructure. So, tactic, diversify housing. Can you add choices by introducing new dwelling types? And really thinking about what will increase or preserve affordability. This is an example from Muller in Austin, Texas, and this is a diagram where you see all of these different dwelling types that are co-located, and a key thing here from a design perspective is that it's not each block having a different type of use, but the uses are shared across the street blocks. So when you're on the street, you see similar dwelling types on either kind of the street, and then the transition to a new type happens in the middle of the block. You can see from the brown to the yellow is one example of that. This is an example of infill, where one might imagine that multi-unit housing is going to be out of character with the detached or single-family houses adjacent. But here you can have the same density, this sort of three-story apartments, but reconfigured into a cottage court arrangement, with everybody then having their own personal entry to their unit. It's the same number of units, the same density, but organized differently by design. Provide environmental repair. So what can be done to increase resilience to floods and drought while also improving water quality? And the images on the right is a former outlying overflow parking lot at a shopping mall in Seattle. And now it's this sort of delightful park that also is a stormwater piece of water infrastructure. We showed this image this morning, another example of a paved mall site that's been entirely converted with a stormwater park and then new housing surrounding it. Build on gray fields. So is there excess asphalt? Where is it? Can you reorganize and reduce the footprint for parking? So let's depave and remove asphalt. This is another example in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so an area that had been for warehousing, turned into a green park that's highly programmed, and it really is about improving wellness and physical activity in the community. It's also regreened. And next tactic, harvest renewables. So how and where to integrate best practices for solar and geothermal heating and cooling systems, rainwater collection and recycling. So again, back at Muller, having solar panels on all of the south or west facing sloped roofs, or back to that Guthrie Green urban park example in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there are geothermal wells, so where there had been the surface asphalt parking lot, which doesn't do much for the environment, to have invisible to the public, but these geothermal wells underneath that whole block. Keep block sizes walkable. So are the blocks more than 1,800 feet in perimeter? I can't translate that to metric right now, but if not, how can you divide them up? And so breaking up the super blocks. And then when you do it, if you still have to have in the short-term surface parking, Ellen alluded to this morning, this is a diagram showing how those surface parking lots can be designed to anticipate future retrofitting. So they're laid out as a grid of streets and blocks and the infrastructure designed for that in anticipation of future retrofitting. Optimize urban form for mobility. This is another case study of the book Uptown Circle, a very well-designed roundabout in Normal, Illinois, where the center of the roundabout is a gathering place with water features and the public comes, and it's a long regional bike and walking trail. Or here, a whole series of trails that have been expanded but integrated all through an existing office park. So where people might have driven around before, integrating all of these walking and biking paths throughout the office park. Invest in the public realm. So where can you build community with new spaces for public gathering and use? And how can your high quality design pay dividends in the projects? And this is back to Wyandanch out on Long Island, where this beautiful park with a seasonal ice rink, and I think you can see in the back there the new train station, which is really beautifully designed as well on former brownfields and parking lots. And here also these classic examples, always worth showing, from Alan Jacobs' Great Streets, about how we design the street room, how we think about that space in front of buildings. And of course, we've seen all sorts of inventive new examples of this during the pandemic period. And then finally, design sites for healthy aging, recognizing demographic change, and what new activities and mobility modes can you integrate into the site design, from raised planter beds for gardenings, electric scooter chairs, adult fitness playgrounds, combination wheelchair bicycles, and so forth. So just to summarize those tactics, which I hope are inspiring to some of you, and that just concludes our presentation, and I think we have time for a little bit of discussion before we let you all folks go. So thank you very much. Not sure. Yeah, should we just get started? Yep. Here we go.
Here we go again.
So we're going to do it like we did yesterday, or this morning rather. Been a long day, what can I say? The only difference is this time the mayor is going to join the panel, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion, not too long because I know everybody is tired. But if you do have questions, again, if you have the Attendify app, please do push your questions through, and we'll transmit those to the audience, or to the panel rather. And here comes Michael Lykoudis as well, and he'll join us.
Testing.
So, Ellen and June, I want to start out by asking you a question that I've asked a number of people, including some of the folks who appeared by video. What do you see as the big lessons of this period coming out of the pandemic for the retrofits that you see? Granted, it's maybe a little early, but what do you see as the key issues right now?
I said that I really do think the fundamentals. I think people are so pent up and locked up that it may not actually be as safe. Who knows how safe we are right now, talking without masks, but people are so eager to get back together. I think the more time we spend online, the more we want our off-screen time to be in great places, and where we can see other people and where we can see some great nature, and we are in great public spaces. So I see retrofitting, I see urbanism in general continuing. The fundamentals of the demographics, the shrinking size of households, all of those factors, I think, are going. I think where people are nervous about, people are nervous about density, but really the issue is overcrowding, not density per se. And I think I think we're going to still see a lot more retrofitting of the suburbs. It's kind of the sweet spot.
Just to add to that, I'd say there's been a lot of headlines in the press about how people are moving from the cities to suburbs during this period, how the suburban housing market is heating up and so forth. And while I think that's true, especially in very expensive metropolitan areas like New York, where I live, it's sort of people were maybe thinking of doing it, and now they've done it, but they want to move to suburbs that have the kinds of amenities and qualities of the urban neighborhoods that they're leaving. So I think they are seeking those places out, and then if they don't find them, they're going to be asking those places to evolve through retrofitting to become more like the neighborhoods that they maybe were in before in Brooklyn, for example, in New York. So we'll be looking for mini Brooklyns all throughout the New York metropolitan area.
I'd like to follow up with a practical question. I think that in very expensive areas, capital is clearly going to see the advantage of good urbanism because developers can make money doing it. But vast swaths of the country, land is still very inexpensive. And lenders and developers are often adverse to risk, and they still see urbanism in places like Carmel often as risky, something new, something different, more risk than going to the edge of town and putting in some houses and a new strip center, retail strip center. So in places outside these major metropolitan areas, I've thought a lot about how, you might have a place where you've got good city managers and a good city council, and mayors, and people see it. We talk about those places, but it's not the majority of places across the country. Most places we're still building sprawl, and we are building poor sprawl where people have to spend a lot of time in their cars, and pedestrians can't get there on foot or by bike safely, or would they want to go for a walk along a busy highway. So I think about how this could change. How do you force the capital? And every city has limited amount of capital. Without the public-private partnerships, how do you force the capital into the brownfields, into the center part of the city? And I thought our proposition, do we need urban growth boundaries? Would that do it?
Actually, urban growth boundaries I would certainly support, because I do think I sort of feel like, our work will never be done. Yes, the exurban growth machine is back in full action right now. And it's the path of least resistance to most quickly pop up houses. But if the new infrastructure spending actually also came, whether it was with urban growth boundaries, whether it came with saying essentially like a lead ND, you have to build contiguous to some existing infrastructure. We're not just going to be building new highways and you're allowed to rezone more farmland.
Okay.
If there were more, if we could get a recognition that the dollar invested in expanding the highway is a short-term, it only makes money for that very short term, and that part of the problem, the reason why we have so much deferred maintenance on our infrastructure is because we built too much of it at low density. And if we're going to repeat that same mistake again, as we're presumably embarking on spending more infrastructure, that is a waste of taxpayer dollars. And so the argument is fundamentally one of, I think we need to be spending on our infrastructure, but we can't do it in that old, wasteful
absolutely
model.
Right. I think urban growth boundaries have worked pretty well in Portland, but I lived in England for a while 4 years ago. I mean, every town has an urban growth boundary. It's just automatic. I think that's true of all of Northern Europe. To build in the countryside is a big deal. It's just taken for granted you don't build in the countryside. It works well there. I do want to take this moment to say a couple things about retrofitting. What a boring idea. Small's boring. These two women are pioneers. June and Ellen deserve a round of applause.
Thank you.
So here's a question from the Attendify group. Recently in St. Louis, this person heard about restoration groups who are like neighborhood associations, but acting more like community development corporations. Have you thought of launching or heard about launching suburban retrofitting groups in communities to help further these ideas?
Could you repeat the key? I missed Were you talking about community ownership models, or what was right at the beginning there? I missed what.
Well, the phrase that was used was restoration groups in St. Louis. There's an emerging phenomenon that is kind of like a neighborhood association, but is more like a community development corporation. I guess a local capacity building organization of stakeholders, I would gather. And what about something like that, a tackling suburban retrofit?
Well, we hope to inspire such actions, and I think one of the things that we hope comes out of this research is, and sharing it like this, is an understanding that a lot of the development that happened across Northern America was done in a kind of formulaic way, and it sort of preceded community, right? Laying the stuff out as people were just arriving. And now these places are more mature, and so how do they, the folks that already live there, have ties and connections to the places, how do they reimagine what the next phase would be? And so the solutions will always be different for every case. And so I think there already are examples. If there is a vacant or largely vacant strip center, trying to figure out, well, who owns it? What kinds of impediments are there for re-envisioning it? And just to also answer the mayor's question and comment earlier, there's a lot of re-inhabitation type stuff that could happen everywhere. And that is actually a lower cost kind of thing than greenfields development. So there's sort of the high-end urbanism sort of thing that maybe doesn't compare well to the conventional sprawl development. But then there's this re-inhabitation stuff, which can be done pretty cheaply and get with great results, with whether it's AstroTurf or breaking up some of that depaving and putting some tents out and really just kind of occupying in a more sort of community-driven way by just getting people out there, putting out some plants and kind of making it happen in a low-cost way. So I think there's both ends of the spectrum that can be kind of engaged with. And I think the re-inhabitation stuff can be done in a very local way, that you just, temporarily take over some space, and both either it's interior space or exterior excess kind of parking lot and paved and empty lots. The kind of things that have been happening in urban neighborhoods for decades might look different in suburbs, because the scale of the vacant lot is not 25 feet by 100 feet. It might be, 1 or 2 acres or more, but there's still really great inventive, locally driven stuff that I think can be done.
Yeah. Michael, your program is somewhat innovative. It's not the only one, I guess, but it's innovative in that you study here in the United States, and your students also go to Rome and do a lot of studies. And I'm wondering what you're finding. Of course, some of this was before the pandemic, but about the lessons of, which is very much the mission of the IMCL, as you know, how, Europe has its own problems with suburban retrofit, right? And we're going to see next year in Paris a remarkable suburban retrofit. What do you think the students are finding? What are the lessons that they're taking home from this experience?
Well, our students, they come from suburban backgrounds for the most part. Their idea of a city is crime and grime. They get to Rome, and they realize that every corner of that city has a history that you could spend a lifetime studying. Everything matters. Here in the US, we often live a life of consumption and waste because we don't have boundaries. We think everything is limitless. We still are living in the 19th century in many ways. In Rome, everything is precious. And in general in Europe. I mean, I don't want to overdo it because they have their own problems too, but conservation and investment is the greatest economic driver over the long term. And I think that's what's happening here in Carmel. I think that's what Mayor Pete did in South Bend. I think there are many places in America where those lessons are being learned and applied. And as our students go there and they live it, and when they go to have a cup of coffee, it's a cultural experience. I go to Starbucks just as much as anybody else, but it's not the same as going to San Eustachio in Rome.
Right.
Let's talk about Rome a bit. I've been there at least a dozen times. It's fabulous, one of the most walkable cities in the world. It's just, have you ever been to a suburb of Rome? It's high-rise sprawl. You ever been to a suburb of Paris? It's worse than American suburb.
It's vertical sprawl, right.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that's the big problem. And actually, there's a group of people that are doing retrofitting in the suburbs in France and in Amsterdam and in Holland and other places. I
Well,
mean,
we'll see
Rob
that
Creer-
next year, yeah.
Yeah, Rob Creer has done a lot of this. The Brightmans have done a lot of this, Nada and Mark, and have really done marvelous things with creating a sense of place out of these really horrible places.
They are horrible. Let's talk about the American Mall a bit. One of the things that has always driven me mad is it parades as a public realm. A mall is not a public realm. They have the right to throw you out. They have the right to throw you out for bad body odor. They have the right to throw you out on any whim they want. That is not a public realm. And yet most people think it is. It poses as one. It ain't. The public realm, you have lots of inalienable rights, not unlimited by any means. Public drunkenness and other things can get you picked up. The other thing is, what are we going to do with all those parking lots around those malls? Flea markets? What else? I mean, what do you recommend for all those parking lots?
You can also just...
Farmers markets?
Yeah, and depave some of the stuff that's not needed
Depave
and turn
some.
it back into meadows and wildflowers.
Or build on it.
No, I'd say build
building on the
housing.
parking
Well,
lots
why not build housing? Why not make it mixed use? Meadows?
It depends where it is, okay? If it's on a filled wetland, you need some of that space.
They're about...
Again, it depends on the context, what's around, what the mall might be sucking away from, right? So sometimes in order to make one place better, you got to kind of remove, if there's just too much retail space, which is true in Northern America.
There are 1,500, I'll give round numbers, there are 1,500 properties in the US that have at one time been an enclosed shopping mall. We've already lost a little over 500, probably at 600 now. I've got in my database 440 proposals to retrofit malls. Of those, 240 have already been substantially built. Little more than half redevelopments, little less than half re-inhabitations, only a handful of regreenings. They're still one of my favorites. Then there's a whole lot where it's a partial redevelopment. It's the building on top of the parking lots around them. So we showed Austin Community College took over the mall, partnered with a developer who is building housing and office on the parking lots around the mall. And they're also regreening, putting in some quads and stuff like that. And that kind of thing, it's really when you combine all three strategies, you're starting to really create a place.
I have a really specific question. Am I on? Mm-hmm. The college of which I was dean got $45 million from Alfred Taubman. Taubman did some of the first malls in America. His sons have taken it over, and they're pretty sharp guys, as well as Al. What are they doing with all their malls? Do you have any idea?
They were bought several years ago.
Oh, you're right. They sold them.
They don't own anymore. I don't know what they're doing.
No.
But theirs were the higher end ones, so they were the ones that were most
They were
they
higher
were in
end.
the group most likely to survive in that they had long-term leases with the most kind of elite stores where there might not be other locations with the same stores. So within a given market, there might only be one Gucci,
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit with another question, or actually two questions that came in that are related, and that is about the governance issue and a question about how urban growth boundaries might, when you have urban growth boundaries, in the case of several different cities that have maybe grown together, and some of the fringe cities aren't interested in growth boundaries, and we see that in the Portland region where people are out in the suburban edges, the almost ex-urban areas are really opposed to being part of that. And related to that is, do urban growth boundaries artificially inflate real estate prices? And I would answer that myself. I'm going to editorialize here that I think they could if you don't balance that with, as I said before, additional ways of building, and we'll talk on Friday about mechanisms to tax land and do other things, other kinds of mechanisms to keep things affordable. But they send a market signal to the market that you need to focus inward, not outward. And I think that's very, very important if you're trying to create urbanism, not just inward to the core, but inward to the centers, a polycentric region, which I think is what
Well, you live in Portland. Tell us about urban growth boundaries in Portland. How are they doing?
I think they are an important market signal. They're not a panacea, but they're very, very important. Not only the urban growth boundary, but also the metro, planning, regional planning agency. Those two things together help, at least inside the urban growth boundary, help everybody to work together, and you don't get this sort of one jurisdiction competing against another to get the biggest Walmart and that sort of thing, and racing to the bottom. Walmart loves to play that game. They know how to do it very well to their credit in terms of how they come out financially on those transactions. But the region maybe doesn't come out so well if they don't work together as a unit. So I think it's not a panacea, but it's a very important advancement.
Let me follow up in a slightly different way to approach an urban growth boundary. Doug, you mentioned, vertical sprawl, and I think that's been an issue. I know it's been an issue in Portland. You've been concerned about, Michael.
Suzanne fought against that very thing.
Yeah, we talked about it many times.
Right.
And we try to limit our buildings here in Carmel to 5 or 6 stories. We look at Dick Jackson's work. We heard from Dick in the tribute to Suzanne earlier today, and in his book he talks about the mental and physical health impacts, not just of horizontal sprawl, but vertical sprawl. Some of the same health impacts from buildings that are too high, where people are isolated from life on the street. So my proposition is, do we want vertical growth boundaries as well for places like Portland and other cities? Is that part of the discussion?
That's a good question. First of all, there are a few exceptions. I mean, Manhattan is going to have tall buildings, and Manhattan is a remarkable place in many, many ways.
We talk about Manhattan too. Let's talk about the other 90% of the U.S. is what I'm
Downtown Seattle has high rises. A lot of people live downtown. I lived downtown for a while. There are cities with high rises that are quite livable downtown. I don't know where you draw the line, Ellen.
I think that one of the issues really is that tall buildings are being sold as a panacea in many cases as a way to get affordability because you get more units, or to get sustainability because you're bringing people into the core and so on. And of course, when you're talking about density, that's very true. But you're begging the question by suggesting that the only way to get density is with tall buildings. There are many cities with tall buildings and low density. Los Angeles. Yeah. There are many buildings with low buildings and high density. Paris. Yeah. So you have to really unpack those issues, I think, and evaluate the specific impacts of a specific building. I don't think you can say all tall buildings are bad. I mean, the Eiffel Tower is pretty well liked by a lot of people. But on the other hand, the idea that all tall buildings are wonderful.
Everybody lives in the Eiffel Tower. It's not exactly a residential building, the Eiffel Tower.
I mean,
but there are towers in Paris, as you know, in the Montparnasse and what's the the area with all the high.
Well, La Défense, but no one
La
goes
Défense.
there.
So what do you think about La Défense? I mean, I think, what do you think?
I was just going to say, I think that there's what we don't want is one solution that suddenly every single place is the same.
Here, here.
What we want is a diversity, so that we want transects and we want some diversity. So I'm fine with having some areas that have tall buildings. What I would like to see would be some service. I mean, the other form of urban growth boundaries are municipal service boundaries. And I think it's that and really getting at the cost issues of infrastructure maintenance. We had a governor in Georgia at one point who said that, you know, if you're moving out if you're tearing up countryside, you get rural services. You're not getting all of the services of the city. Don't come at, you know, and that has to be respected. So, and both from a cost perspective and from just having a diversification of living choices.
Yeah, diversity is a good thing.
If I could just say just a couple of things. You know, having traveled around the world, you know, from places in central China to Pacific Rim, you know, South America, Europe. Unfortunately, I've not been on the African continent, but I've found that there is something that is innately human about all these this diversity of places, from Hong Kong to Athens to Frankfurt to all these amazing places that we go to and spend thousands of dollars to go visit, as someone pointed out earlier. And I think that what we have to do is try to understand that humanity that built these places had its flaws, but it has its positive aspects, and those positive aspects are the things that we have to nurture and develop. And we are at a crossroads. The pandemic exposed the inhumanity of isolation.
Yeah,
and certainly. We have to find a way to all live together, which is urbanism, and build wisely, which is architecture. And it's one discipline. It's not two. And we have this bifurcation in architecture schools about architecture and urbanism. And urbanism does not mean you forget the countryside. You have to preserve the countryside. You need the countryside. You need that meadow. You can't pave over everything. So I think the way that we need to go forward, the thing that we have learned from the pandemic, what we have learned of the last few decades, is that how important, how precious our humanity is, how we can't lose it, and there are so many things that are there to distract us from that human purpose. And the pandemic was one. We will go back to living in cities because we need each other. How we use our technology so we don't simply go faster than our headlights can see. All of these things are important. How do our young kids, how does the next generation grow up in feeling the specialness of a place rather than going to the same Starbucks all over the world?
Thank you guys so much for a wonderful discussion.